Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Endless Report for July 27th, 2021. I'm Brian, and with me today is Anthony. Hi, Anthony.
How's it going, Brian?
It's going good. It's the summer.
Yeah.
It's nice out, so I'm happy. Are you happy?
Same here. Happy to be on the
All right.
stream today. Happy to talk about all this exciting gaming news and all these topics.
So I think today's going to be a little different than last time. Last time, both because it was the news of the week and because we're hardware geeks, we were extremely technically focused in our news last time with the drop of the Steam Deck being the big item of the week. We spent a lot of time talking about that. We talked a little bit about Switch Pro. We talked a little bit about, where this whole issue of gaming in the cloud versus gaming on your device, and where does the power live, and how is the industry going to evolve there. Today, I think we've got a couple of topics right off the bat that are less hardware focused and more industry news focused, and less like, oh, what's the big game release coming focused, but more focused on some trends in the industry, good, and in the case of the second item, we'll cover particularly bad. And I think one of the reasons we wanted to cover those, Anthony, was because with Endless Studios being all about introducing folks to game making and educational opportunities in game making, a lot of people who are checking it out probably do want to become game makers, or are thinking about becoming game makers, and are thinking about breaking into the industry one day. And there are some things that the industry is known for that are awesome, and there are some things that the industry is known for that are not so awesome. And I think folks having a perspective on that, as applies to the news of the day as they go in, is important.
Agreed.
So we're gonna dive into a few things, and I think the first topic we've got on the list today, Anthony, is some news that came out earlier this week about possible delays on some highly anticipated games that are supposed to come out this coming fall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so to kick that off, there's been some speculation about specifically first-party titles from Sony and Microsoft about if the fall season will have a lot of delays. So Horizon Zero Dawn was the subject of this article, and while there's no news about Horizon Zero Dawn right now, that's actually why it's concerning. So we're almost in August. It's a 2021 fall release date. They've had a spring showcase on it, a whole state of play, PlayStation State of Play, where they went through gameplay, they talked to the developers, and they said they were on track for a fall release.
Yeah, but it looked pretty good too.
And it looked fantastic.
Yeah.
But obviously, with everything going on right now, especially with COVID concerns, I know that developer Guerrilla Games, I think COVID's really strict right now in the Netherlands. I think I think they're in stricter lockdowns, even past the summer. I think they kind of relocked. I'm not sure exactly what's going on over there, but I'm assuming that with work from home and all those concerns, and the delays that have been happening all year, it's potential that this game could be delayed as well, especially with the silence going into the fall. And on top of that, we also have Halo Infinite, which is a marquee title. Was supposed to be on the launch title for the Xbox Series X and S. Unfortunately, it was delayed into 2021. And we're looking at a fall release date for that as well, but also just a window and no specific date. And those are kind of the two biggest, first-party games coming out from Sony and Microsoft this fall, with the obvious absence of God of War as well, which was supposed to come out this year, which was already delayed to 2022, and kind of had a similar, appearance up to that delay. They went silent. It still was set to 2021. There was no real other indication. And then after some silence, it was, revealed that it was also going to be delayed. So I guess my question going into this, well, there's not really a lot of news to talk about per se. It's kind of with that gap of news. As someone in the industry, how do you perceive that? Because I think a lot of people at home get frustrated, or gamers who are excited for a new game, or like, what is going on? I want some news, but obviously it's much more complicated than just getting it out when we want to. And obviously there's a lot more that goes into that. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that issue.
It is super complicated. So, I mean, I would start with the first perspective I take on it is the same. I think the same perspective that a lot of gamers who aren't in the industry take on it, which is, if you're looking forward to a game, you want to know when it's coming out. You get your heart set on it, and if it doesn't come out, or if it gets delayed, that's a bummer. And as we saw with Cyberpunk, which has become the poster child, I think, for this phenomenon in a lot of ways. The first time they announced a delay, the community, even though it was, and I shouldn't even say the first time they announced a delay, because the game had been delayed
multiple times
and had a long development cycle. But sort of the first time they said there's going to be a delay, close to the release date, the reaction of the gaming community and the big fan base that had already built was, hey, take all the time you need, right? Get it done, get it right. We'll wait. It's all good. And honestly, I think that the fact that CD Projekt Red had a good reputation, had released amazing games that were highly regarded before, they had a lot of credibility with their user community. And so people were tolerant of that. And they're like, oh, if these guys are saying they need more time, let's give them more time. And we want to see a good game get released at the end of the day. And then they announced, I think, the second delay after they knew they were going to blow through that first time frame. And people were still pretty much like, oh, well, that kind of stinks. But I mean, I guess they're saying they need more time, and we're getting a little impatient, but all right, we'll tolerate that. And so people maybe a little more grudgingly tolerated it. And then they announced, I think, yet another delay. And then people were like, understandably so, guys, you need to get your act together.
Yeah.
And there was definitely less goodwill. And then they put out an incredibly buggy game at its initial launch that they actually had to withdraw from the market on certain platforms. And we all know what happened then. And they definitely took a reputational hit. So I think that the games industry has changed over time. So like Anthony, when did you, because again, I'm a lot, as I bemoaned last time, I'm quite a bit older than you are. So what year did you start to get into games? When did you become a gamer, and what device were you gaming on?
I would say it's time from I was a baby. To be cliche, I mean, I was playing on the PS1 when I remember that my brother had that. And that was a big deal for me. So pretty much since like the start of the whole PlayStation, Xbox, kind of obviously I didn't have the Nintendo 64. That was kind of like a little before my time. Yeah. So pretty much the start of the Xbox original and the PlayStation 1 was really where I kicked off, and obviously with the Nintendo Wii and everything else. So really that whole pretty much since 2000, late 90s, I pretty much played a lot of what I could get my hands on, what I was interested in. But it was really when I was, I'd say, in middle school, elementary school, when I played Skyrim and games like that, and some more RPG games and things that really got me into it. And I bring Skyrim up because it was a similar situation with them, where that was a developer like CD Projekt Red, where they had a reputation for certain things, definitely a buggy reputation on the other hand, but they also had some issues with Fallout 76 and other games that came out not working. They had refund policies, very similar issue. And I guess that brings up the whole idea of, have things changed in the past? Maybe I wasn't aware of it because I was younger, but maybe when I was younger, I'm not sure the delays, not that they didn't happen, because I'm sure they happened all the time, but maybe had some different connotations or worked in a different way, or maybe the community didn't react in the same way, I should say.
So first of all, your knowledge of games, because you started gaming so young, goes back to a time where things worked as they did since the very beginning of the home video game industry in the late 70s, which is back then, games were released on physical media. And what that meant was a team had a deadline. The deadline was relatively rigid, not only because they were off, as is still often the case today, not only because they were trying to hit a certain date that they think was good from a marketing standpoint, like, oh, we're trying to have a holiday season release or something, but also because they had physical manufacturing capacity lined up to make the cartridges or make the CD-ROMs or whatever it was. And so you had a rigid, relatively inflexible release window. You had to deliver your gold master, your final, I'm ready to have you go now make all the cartridges or CDs version to manufacturing by a certain time to hit your release date. And there wasn't no internet, right? So that meant if you shipped a game that went to manufacturing and had bugs in it, the game had bugs with it. For a time, there literally was no patching it. There was no concept of patching a game that was already released because there was no mechanism to deliver a patch to your users. Then things started to change where as the internet became more ubiquitous, you could patch things. That really didn't kick in until the Steam Xbox 360 era. And so that changes everything. So that's one dynamic that has definitely changed. To the point that, as anyone who plays games on a modern PC or console will tell you, virtually every big title launches with a day one patch now. And the reason for that is teams are still working against deadlines. And I'll give you a little inside baseball here from the industry. If you are a developer or a publisher and you're trying really this is the public, we can talk about what the distinction between developer and publisher is if folks are interested. But if you're a publisher and you want to release a game on any one of the first party app stores, right? Whether that is, Microsoft's or Sony's or Nintendo's or what have you, there's a whole process you go to get approved as a developer. And there's a whole process you go through when you're getting ready to release your game, preliminary to releasing the game. That's all about validating your game's content as well as your storefront presence for the game. So you meet all these requirements, and your screenshots and your videos have to be and your trailers have to be to such and such specifications, but you upload preliminary builds of your game that are validated, especially when you're going onto something like a first party console, that are validated by a QA team at the first party. And again, they're not putting the game through an exhaustive QA like the studio does internally on every aspect of quality, but they are making sure that it runs on the console, that it doesn't do anything it's not supposed to do, that it doesn't spontaneously brick people's consoles and things like that. And you've got to hit with these builds, they often call them lock check builds, well in advance of your planned release date. And it is often the case that you have to submit a quote unquote final build weeks in advance of your release date, when you're probably still working on the game. And so you do that build gets locked in as your release build weeks in advance. And then any changes you make in between the date you submit that build and your release date have to go into a patch. And that's why almost every game has a day one patch, because nobody is done with a game 2 weeks before. In fact, no one is ever done with a game. There's a famous saying in game making that games are never finished. They're just abandoned. So you have that whole phenomenon going on. So, I mean, the other aspect of it is game companies, as gamers, we tend to think of game companies as these big monolithic, it's this one entity, it's this one thing, it's there's a bunch of guys in suits, typically, we think of them as guys, right? As males in suits. And game companies are complex, right? And different groups within them have different agendas. So the key thing to know is the team making the game, every single person on the development team, from the most junior artist to the people in QA to the team leads on the team, they want to make the best game possible 100% of the time on 100% of games. They're extreme big games, little games, big studio, indie studio, dude working or gal working at home in their basement. They want to make a good game, right? No one wants to make a lousy game. And they're passionate about it, and they devote lots of time and effort to it. And they always want more time and more resources because that will make the game better. The people in the publishing side, the studio heads, the people, want the game to be as financially successful as possible. Now, that typically aligns with making the game good, or at least to a large degree, right? Because if you make a lousy game, it will get poorly reviewed, especially on smaller and indie titles. We've seen this in our studios. There's a very direct relationship between your Metacritic score and your sales performance, right? And it makes a big difference whether your game is a 78 Metacritic, which is a pretty good game. That's 78 Metacritic, right? If you were looking at a game and you're like, should I get this or not? And you saw 78, what would your reaction be?
You'd be like, okay, maybe this doesn't look terrible. It's probably a good game.
It's probably a good game, right? If it was a 60, you'd be like, oh,
yeah, something's going on. Maybe let's check this out. Yeah.
Right. If it's an 85, you're like, this is a great game.
Yeah.
And there's a huge difference between a 78, an 82, and an 80 and an 85. Right. Sure. So the goals of the dev team and the people in the studio leadership or the accounting department at the studio are largely aligned. except for certain phenomenon, right? One of them is release windows. And this is what happened on Cyberpunk. The team, as many people on the team have come out and said since it was released, would have preferred more time. The studio leadership gave them more time over a period of years. And as it was coming down to the wire, like we talked about a few minutes ago, once they became in danger of slipping past their holiday season released window, that's when the studio heads finally said, no, we got to go. And I'm assuming, again, I don't have, it's not like I work there or I have any inside knowledge, but indirectly from my own experience, what I can say is almost certainly someone did the math and concluded, we know this game is buggy. If we release this game and take the reputational hit and put it out there and even have to give a bunch of refunds, but certainly take the reputational hit as the studio, but we put it out there now for the holiday season, we will at the end of the day make more money, and I believe significantly more money than if we missed that particular release window. That's the math, right? And I'm sure just on the dollars and cents of that,
it made sense. I think it was day one. They recovered the entire profit. They profited day one, I think, off the entire project.
And they may not have done that. It may have been would the project have been unprofitable if they had waited another 3 months? Probably not. Right. But it may very well have left significant money on the table. And so on the dollars and cents, I'm sure they did that math and I'm sure it was correct. Reputationally, they took a big hit. It will definitely impact people's perceptions or considerations the next time they release a major title. Will people be lining up to get it day one, or will they be like, I'm going to wait until it's discounted 20% because it's been around for a while and they've had the chance to do a couple of patches? Certainly some people will. Will that be enough to have a meaningful impact on a company long term? Who knows, right? But that's the kind of equation. And again, for me, it's a little bit like if the classic Ford Pinto story. For those who don't know, again, this is going back to the, I think, early 80s. Ford built a car called the Pinto, and during the development process, they figured out that if the car got hit, I think it was in a rear end collision with a certain impact, the placement and construction of the gas tank was such that it would explode in a gigantic fireball. And they were like, oh man, that's really bad. And then someone in the, accounting and legal department did the math. And again, probably correctly on the math, concluded it will cost us more to retool the car, redesign it, retool production, remake a bunch of cars we've already made to fix this, then we will pay out in wrongful death lawsuits if we put the thing we have out on the market. And so they put the thing out on the market and people died. And this came out, in lawsuits about that years later. In fact, they made a movie based on it with, Gene Hackman, I think, was the lead in it. I'm trying to remember the name of the film. But anyway, you don't, right? So I understand, even in that case, they were probably correct. Like they did the math properly, they did their arithmetic properly, but you don't do that, right? And it's not moral. And the moral considerations aside, you're going to take a hit reputationally long term. And I think that's part of it. I mean, how do you like? I mean, how do you react? Is that I don't know, Anthony, if you personally were like, oh man, I'm stoked for Cyberpunk to come out or not. But I mean, how does that affect your perception of a studio as a gamer?
I definitely think it's funny that you say that, because I think I saw that first trailer for Cyberpunk. I had to be 13 years old, and now I'm a 21-year-old man. And
my gosh, it's crazy to think it was in development that long that you went from a young teenager to an adult. Oh my god!
I had just turned 13 years old, I think, when that trailer came out, and now I'm sitting here discussing it. But so it's kind of funny to look back and be like, wow. So there was definitely an excitement factor I kind of grew up with that just in the background of my head. Like that's gonna be. I was definitely an RPG fan. Like this is gonna be a great game. I wasn't a huge fan of the Witcher series only because I didn't have time to get into it. It had nothing to do with the game itself, but I did have excitement for that, and I came into it, especially with those demos leading up to the release, being like, oh my goodness, this is gonna be game of the century. Like I was definitely up there with the excitement. So I do understand from a fan's perspective, that growing kind of, I want it to be the best, but I'm kind of getting bitter and I'm kind of getting impatient. And that kind of, being from the perspective of not putting in that work and understanding what's going on behind the scenes, it is frustrating to wait for something that you've been excited for years and years. And there are other games that are probably coming out years from now that I'm still waiting on the same way. So I get that perspective, but, coming back to the logistical sides of things, it's interesting to think how obviously there is always that, and this goes beyond video games, that distinction between the logistical business side of things and the art that you're trying to put out. There's always going to be that struggle of how is it reasonable to put this out, versus time constraints, the monetary constraints, while also putting out a vision that we stand by and are proud of as a company, whether that's as a developer or as the publisher overseeing, the release of this game. So those are two very different perspectives. And I think that, bringing the moral aspect of it, obviously with the Ford Pinto example, like obviously there are moral lines that can sometimes be crossed when you're too focused on the logistical lens of things. And that's obviously a really big concern. So I think from my perspective, I guess seeing this for so long, especially with this example, and then looking ahead at the article we started off with the, this fall's games, again, I think there's an old quote. I'm not remembering who said this. I know it was a Nintendo executive, but a delayed game is always better than an unfinished game that comes out. So I always think, a delayed game will eventually be perfect, but in Cyberpunk's case, it isn't. So there's a logistical, dilemma there where it's like, it's not, there are so many different pieces that come into play there. It's not just, maybe just more time, it'll always be better. It could come down to planning, maybe the scope of, I know Cyberpunk was on multiple platforms, there were issues there. And I think it's just sometimes when there's not a sync of all those different moving parts, that can create, a lot of catastrophe in that case.
I think the way the industry is evolving, though, is in the consciousness of gamers, and it's baked into decisions. It certainly is in mine when I think of things as a gamer, because again, back in the day when it was like, oh, Nintendo is shipping Super Mario Brothers 3 for the original NES. Mm-hmm. That was highly anticipated. It was a physical release, so they had hard and fast dates, and you had an expectation. If you were, a 10-year-old or whatever I was when that came out, you had expectations that the game was done and complete and good because you couldn't conceive of it any other way. And so you had no problem if it was valuable enough for you to go in and plunk down $50 of your allowance money to get that game if that's what you wanted, right? My perception now as an adult, and again, I'm gonna like 20, 50 or 40 or $50 for a game for a 10-year-old where that's allowance, that was several months of allowance.
That's a commitment.
For me.
That's a big deal. Yeah.
Back in the day. Whereas now, I'm an adult, I'm employed, I do okay, right? And I am much more hesitant now, even though the dollars are less meaningful to me. I'm much more hesitant now to buy a game day one than I would have been as that 10-year-old sweating every dollar of his allowance money, because the perception I have now, and tell me if you buy this or if you think this is the perception that gamers have in general, or if you're watching or on the chat, let us know if I'm right in saying this. My perception is the product that gets launched on day one is not complete. It's going to have bugs. They're going to go through several patch cycles and fix it. And sometimes folks offer, a modest launch day discount, 10%, 20% launch day discount. But in general, it's the most expensive that game is ever going to be. And so if I'm going to pay day $1 for a buggy game, I have to be super excited about the game. And I do that. If I'm going to do it, I do it with my eyes open, right? I'm like, I'm getting in on this day one because I'm so excited for whatever it is this game is about. Yeah. I'm willing to pay a premium for a buggy game. I don't do that a lot.
Yeah, neither do I. And that's it's definitely a mental decision now. I think it's funny that, back in the day, especially when you heard people saying, we've seen this in the past. This is example X right here. Like, this is where this developer, this publisher even has done this practice, has it's released a buggy game. Don't pre-order their next game. Send a message, right? Like, that's always like that. You see it on like a forum, like someone's like, don't pre-order games. That's that's how we'll show them. And then obviously people do pre-order games. Games get released buggy. It happens all the time, and you kind of build up. Like, I used to be that kind of person of, when I'm buying maybe 1 or 2 games, the whole year or something, I want to know, like, those are I'm a diehard fan. I'm going to buy that day one because that's what I'm passionate about. I don't want to wait a year for the sale, not because I don't want to, get a better deal and have a less buggier game, but because I'm excited right now. If there's a new Star Wars movie coming out and you're a Star Wars fan, you don't want to wait a year later to find out what happens. You're going to be there on night one, even if you like it or don't like it. So I think that it's definitely more of a conscious decision now. It's something I think about every time I look at a game. I often don't pre-order anymore unless it's something I'm just really, really.
Yeah, that's what your watch list is. Put it on the watch list.
Yeah, right? Exactly. I look at it.
See what the day one reviews are like. Yeah, see if what the Metacritic is. See what they're saying about the level of bugginess. And there's even a huge difference between waiting 2 weeks out from day one when they've probably gotten at least one patch out there. And again, then you're probably still paying full price, but you're paying full price for a patched game, not a unpatched,
or even games that aren't even buggy. Like I'll give you one example. I just played Ratchet and Clank, the new one on PS5. I loved it. It was awesome. I thought it was great. They talk about the loading speeds and all that, and really you kind of forget about it. It's one of those games where you first put it on your TV, like, oh my goodness, I've never seen anything like this. The graphics were really that impressive, and then you kind of get used to it because you just kind of like get into it and you just become immersed. That being said, there were different resolution modes for that game. You could play it in the high resolution mode, 30 FPS, or you could scale it down a bit, but you could play it in 60 FPS full speed. And that's what I opted to do just because I wanted to have a better gameplay experience. Then, no real large bugs. It was still a great, I was happy I bought it. I bought it the day after it came out maybe. So I made sure everything was working, jumped on, got it. And then like a month later, they released another patch where they basically made a new mode where you could play it in full 4K, but at like a 40 FPS middle ground. They did a trick with like putting it up to 120 hertz and then dividing it. So which is just a very interesting decision. But we're getting to the point where, like you said before, we talk about games going gold and having, a physical release where you have to have that working title, so you could print your CDs, you could print your ROM, whatever you're putting that game on. And now it's kind of like, not even if a game's not complete, it's going gold, it's complete, there's no bugs, but why don't we just improve it if we want to afterwards? It's almost like a logic. There's this perfectionism where you could just, whenever you want, patch in something new, even if it wasn't broken on launch. But I platinum trophied that game. I did everything there was to do. I moved on. I ended up deleting it to make space for something else. And then they released a patch. And I was like, oh, well, it would have been nice to play it that way, but I'm not going to go replay the entire game for a slightly different frame rate experience that I already enjoyed it. So it is interesting to see things be so fluid like that.
That comes back to something we touched on last week in a different context, which was the notion of game franchises and a single game being a franchise, right? Because you can release DLC, you can release new features. We do, to give you a small studio perspective on this, because Eline is an indie game developer. We're not doing AAA budget games. We're not doing AAA team size games. And the reality is a small studio like that is much more sensitive to delays than a big studio. Because when CD Projekt Red is doing some of those decisions we were talking about a few minutes ago, they're choosing between, if I delay this a little bit, my profits aren't going to be as large as they otherwise would. That's the calculation they're doing, right? Whereas it makes a huge difference for a small studio for a project to go 10% over budget. Like if we're like, oh man, this project is going 10% over budget, it's tracking to do that. We're sweating a little bit, right? Because we don't have infinite capital
to keep
10%, throwing at it. That matters. And so smaller studios are sensitive to that kind of stuff. So we released a game at the height of the pandemic last year called Beyond Blue. It's a game that we had been working on for several years. We've ended up finishing it and doing our crunch phase, which wasn't the worst crunch phase by any stretch of the imagination, but the team was crunching on it, in the midst of having to transition from not being able to go into the office anymore and everybody working at home. We towards the end of the development process, we had to move up the release date, move up, not back, move up the release date by a month for one platform, and had to figure that out in our development schedule. And so we did that. The game had some bugs at launch. It was not horribly buggy, by any stretch of the imagination. And we've added new features to it since launch, including some real features that the community has responded very well to. For example, like we added a photo mode to it because it's an undersea exploration in the game. You're swimming around as a diver. There's like lots of beautifully modeled,
which is awesome, by the way. I love that photo mode.
Thank you. I didn't really work on it, so I'll keep praise on the team who did.
Always love a photo mode in any game, really.
Always so we didn't launch with a photo mode, and we added one, through an update. And I feel like it's your perspective on is interesting because in your case, they didn't ship with a game mode that probably would have enhanced your enjoyment of the game. And it wasn't really about adding additional features or content to the game. It's like a mode that would have enhanced your enjoyment of it had you had it. And so I could see some resentment there. Whereas I think when you add a whole new feature that wasn't there, it's like, well, I paid $20 for this without photo mode, and I considered that to be a reasonable investment. And now they gave me a whole new feature that wasn't there before, but I don't have to pay anymore. That's okay. That's cool.
That's almost motivation to go back, I think, versus the other example kind of being like a quality of life thing where it's like, this is a single player experience that I already completed. So I'm not going to do another playthrough just now, just for the sake of the quality of life. It's more so when you have new content or additional. And I think it's funny that, the idea of content these days is a lot different. I think, especially that I talked about before, like the consoles I started on and playing a PS2 game, or, the amount of levels, or like say it was a racing game, you'd have 15 maps at launch, and there wasn't a focus on if you had DLC, you'd be paying maybe $20-$30. Or I remember the Call of Duty map packs, you get 2-3 extra maps, and that was another $20-$30 investment. And that was worth it because that was an exciting thing to play on and play new levels and new experiences. But at the same time, I think maybe this is more of the perception of the gamer, or I feel like there is an expectation of more, or wanting more content, or sometimes, especially with these, we talked about these director's cuts last week and these upgrade editions, and people are like, well, why do I have to pay more for an upgrade? And I'm like, well, there's a lot of work that went into an upgrade, and that's a lot more content.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think it's interesting the way we frame how we monetize or shape those updates.
And my perspective on it is, as long as it's a fundamentally honest transaction that the consumer can evaluate, it's all good. If I give you something for free that you didn't have, most of the time, your example notwithstanding, that's a good thing, right? If I take something away that you did have, that's bad. If I say, here is a thing you might want, this is what it includes, and the cost for it is X, then you can say, oh, well, is that worth X to me? And if so, I'll pay for it.
Yep.
If it's like, hey, you didn't know it, but to actually succeed at this game, you need to pay this much on top of the $50 you paid for the game to unlock to get the keys to unlock the loot boxes or whatever. I don't really consider that as fundamentally transparent a transaction. And again, if it were good game design, I might be more forgiving of it, but in general, I don't think it makes games more fun. So
and I think that brings up, obviously, there's been the scandals and with the loot boxes, and there's been lawsuits about gambling and pay to win, and the monetization of games has obviously been changing and very fluid in different game types as well. But I think it's like you said, it has to be an honest transaction. When it's a multiplayer game, and obviously this is a very different subject, but when you're willing to pay, the extra dollars on an extra skin, or that, that extra little power up that's not affecting much other things, and you're not really missing out if you don't, that's your decision. And I think that's fine.
Yeah.
But when it comes to, especially, I don't want to just say it's just single player versus multiplayer, because it's obviously, more complicated than that. But you see some games like, I believe it was Shadow of War, the Lord of the Rings series, where you had to pay an extra fee, like in the middle of the game, to get the ending cutscene. So you would beat the game, and then it would say, well, now you have to either, spend about 90 hours grinding, or, spend $5 on these loot boxes so that you could see you actually finally beating the game. And that's something that no one knew was going to happen or expected when they paid the original $60. So I think, like you said, if it's something that's upfront, is logical and is saying this is the service I'm providing, this is the content, and this is what it's valued at, I really don't have any problem with that. It's just more on a game to game basis of what I'm interested in paying for. So that's your own decision as a consumer, I think. But I think it's interesting in comparison to other industries as well about what people deem complete or not complete, and the kind of contextualization of that. Like, you wouldn't go see a movie that wasn't finished and didn't have an ending. You'd wait till they edited the last 15 minutes of the movie, and then you'd watch. So there is kind of like a perception of what do we deem as finished anymore in a digital age where a game going gold isn't that consequential or that limiting to the finishing of development. It is interesting to think, where do we draw that line, per game, or what's acceptable?
Yeah, and you can acknowledge that reality in the way that we were talking about with making your day one purchase decision or not. You can acknowledge that reality as a publisher by saying, hey, by doing things like early access or other community driven development strategies, if that is organic to your vision and what you're trying to do with the game. But I think, to kind of put a bow on this part of the discussion, for folks who are thinking about getting into the industry, the tension between the team always wanting to make the game better, right? And the folks, in studio leadership or in business leadership, having to balance that with the financial realities of that. Because what I want to avoid saying is, the team is always good.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
For wanting that.
Like
and the guys in the
them.
corporate office are always villains. It's not like the case. If you think about it this way, if you could make 50% more profit on your game by releasing a somewhat buggy version in time for the holiday release window versus delaying it 3 months to have it be less buggy, that's real money that you could have to employ people further, to employ people making another game. People will lose their jobs over that. That's not just money going into the CEO's pocket. You could invest it in R&D on your next game, right? Or on developing a new concept. These are, and if you don't have it, you can't do it. And so it's not, and again, all teams always want to release, to make the game better and better. And that's very admirable. I don't mean to suggest that there's anything better. And if I was hiring people for my studio, I would want it full of people like that. At the same time, they in fact will never release a game. I'm overgeneralizing, but the sort of taking it to its most absurd degree is if someone doesn't intervene and say, guys, we got to release a game here at some point, then there are a lot of teams who would never release a game. And that tension is something people who go into the industry will have to deal with. The pressure to hit a date, the balancing of we want to do more versus the realities of production and budgets and when are we going to release something. That's something that folks are going to have to accept as part of life going into an industry, especially a hits driven industry like the game business is. And so I think that's the reality of it, and I think folks should go into it with eyes open. So let's switch topics to a more depressing. That's a depressing day today. To a more depressing topic, but I think something that folks also should go into the industry with eyes open about, which is the stuff going on with Activision Blizzard and the lawsuit that was filed by the state of California. So regulators in the state of California filed a lawsuit on July 20th against Activision, Blizzard, Call of Duty franchise, many others, World of Warcraft, over their discriminatory employment practices, particularly their discriminatory employment practices towards women. The meat of the lawsuit really comes in two parts. Part one is more. I was going to use the phrase "run of the mill," which is not a phrase I would like to use about discriminatory behavior, but it is the kind of discriminatory employment behavior that people have come to expect and I think have a perception is somewhat institutionalized, which is there were many allegations in the suit of women not receiving equal pay to men, not having equal access to promotion opportunities, things of that nature. And that's the still very bad, but again, I think people
historically bad. No,
recognize that, right? The part that was more eye-opening and also bad was, straight up completely inappropriate behavior towards or involving female colleagues by male employees, doing a highly inappropriate, bro club kind of behavior stuff. So sexual, and we'll avoid getting into all the details, but, sexual harassment, beyond anything that could possibly be ambiguous in any way, things involving alcohol, things involving physical abuse, things in allegedly managers having relationships with subordinates and things and behavior getting so bad that it is alleged that in one such incident the female employee was driven to suicide. So really, really not good allegations in the suit. And then to double down on it, the official response to the suit from Activision, or a couple of the official responses to the suit from Activision, were basically saying it was without merit and the state of California, was being frivolous and ridiculous and making stuff up. That was sort of a couple of statements that that Activision put out. At the same time that was going on, you had current and former executives in private emails that have since been revealed to team members or former colleagues, acknowledging some of the stuff, acknowledging a poor culture, acknowledging their role in it, and expressing contrition over it. So they're doing that on the one hand, while the official studio response is, this is, bogus. And then a lot of employees acknowledging that it was true, employees at Activision Blizzard taking their company to task over the official statements. And then the news today on this, today being the 27th here, Tuesday, being that tomorrow, Wednesday, employees at the Blizzard part of Activision Blizzard are organizing a work stoppage over, over the culture overall, demanding changes to the culture, but in part over the company's response to it as well. So that's the nature of this story. Again, you can Google it, you can check it out. There's a lot of details that have come out. There's a lot of activity on social media about it. There's a lot of activity in the industry press about it. If you're interested in the details, it's not the first time something like this has happened with a big game company or a small game company or individuals in the game industry. But it's certainly going on now. So that's the news, Anthony. I guess your reactions or questions about that as a gamer.
Yeah, it's obviously a very upsetting thing to hear. I think it's one thing that is concerning, especially from the perspective that we look at, is if you're going into the industry, what does one expect that culture elsewhere? Does one see that prevalent in the industry? No industry is immune to societal problems and to a bad culture. So how do we resolve that as an industry, and how do other companies react to this, and how do individuals who have been affected by this, move forward? I think it's just a tough, as a person who's a fan of games, who's someone who aspires to be part of these companies, you look at something like that and you think, how is this culture able to last so long? And also, how do we move forward from that? How is this prevented in the future, specifically in terms of the games industry? Because I think it's obviously been put to light by a lot of people in the industry now. How do we move forward from this? So I think it's a tough, from an outside perspective, to know that or to see how that happens. But it's just obviously a very upsetting thing to hear.
Upsetting is the right word.
Maybe not enough of a word. Yeah.
And tough is the right word too, because it's tough, and all the issues and all the nuance you pointed out there are real. I don't have big answers to this. I don't have special insight into it. I've also, in full disclosure, I've never worked at a big game company. I've worked at an indie game company that has a mission to make games that have positive impact that was founded with people who are very, of which I was one, who are very passionate and serious about that mission. So I can't speak firsthand to the culture of big game companies or how prevalent it is in the industry. I only know what people who I now know through the industry have relayed to me and what I read in the press. There is no question that the games industry started as a boys club, because gaming started, video games started as boys club. There is no question that with things like, if you remember Gamergate several years back, there is a perception of people who have been gaming for a long time and who come from that perspective of like, we own gaming and we are the guardians or custodians of the social norms of gaming. And if we say, women, minorities, non-traditional gamers are you're not part of that culture, well, then you're not part of that culture. And because we own the culture, there is that perception, right? That's bad. It's true of gamers, and it's true, I believe, to an extent within the industry as well. That's not good by any stretch of the imagination. I didn't nominate anybody to do that job. I don't need anybody to be the cultural enforcer of what they think gaming should be about or who should be included in it as gamers or in the industry. We're doing fine. You know what I mean? And so I don't think we need that. What should people be prepared for on this issue if they're going into the industry, particularly if you're going into, because again, I'm an older, I'm a middle-aged, so I'm not among the oldest folks in the game industry. But I'm middle-aged. I'm a white male. I'm very conscious of that. I would not attempt to speak firsthand to the experience of people who are different from me in ways that are relevant. But I think it is still, just objectively, it is still a majority male, overwhelming majority male, like 75% plus male industry. And what I would say, so you should expect that this cultural trend, I'm not saying every allegation in that story is true exactly as written or not, though it wouldn't surprise me if they were. And I'm certainly not saying they aren't true, or attempting to cast doubt on it. But my point being, where there's smoke, there's fire, generally speaking. And that culture exists. And that is something that if I have a daughter, she's young. She's but more than a decade away from making career choices. It would be if she's like, I would like a career in the game industry. It is a thing I would talk about with my daughter. And I would say, you need to go into that with your eyes open, because these are the kind of things you would expect. And if I had a son who was contemplating a career in the games industry, I would be saying, you need to go into it with your eyes open. And even though you may not be the victim, and you would find if you chose to, you would find a place in the old boys culture. You need to do better than that, and you need to, the thing you need to come to terms with is how you could be a better ally or a better agent for cultural change in the industry rather than perpetuating it.
Understood. And I think it's interesting you bring that up, from a generational perspective, because I think that obviously it's an issue that goes beyond gaming. Obviously, you have those stereotypes in any industry, and especially in gaming, of like expecting a male or being surprised that someone doesn't fit the labels that you would expect of a stereotypical gamer or game developer. But the truth is that when it doesn't, that is what it is, and you have to find a way to be open-minded and look at and respect the idea that you have to be someone who can look out for others, not just yourself, regardless if you are someone who experiences this or not. So I think from a generational perspective and a cultural perspective, it's something that's more so, I think, on the industry in general, not just the games industry, but industry and the corporate world in general, to put better human practices and treating, people with respect and dignity that they deserve. And I think that when you bring that into a corporate atmosphere, and that is something that isn't, isn't guaranteed, that's a big problem that needs to be addressed. And I think if you're on the outside of that problem, all you can do is you be an advocate for change when you see something that is wrong. So when you see something that you don't like or looks disrespectful or looks institutionally wrong, then you need to speak up, because nothing's going to change. And I think a lot of times when you have, disgusting acts or you have terrible things that happen, you have the people that cause it, and you also have the bystander effect. You have people that are afraid, because I think a big idea is that, well, if I say something, is that going to jeopardize my chances or my career? And that's a bad culture to have, because when you have a culture of fear and a culture of worrying about, what's, sticking with the status quo, good or bad or terrible, a lot of times human beings want to stick with, what's doing what they're being told to do, but that's not always the right thing. And I think, to have a moral, compass and do what you think is the right thing is probably the most general, I guess, advice I could give, because I think it's something that's a larger problem than just the individuals.
It's what I want to say is, and don't get me, I don't mean this to say I'm disagreeing with you, but what I would say is it is to acknowledge the flip side of it. It is hard when you are low man or woman on the totem pole. It is hard when you are a run-of-the-mill employee in any organization, and you're not in management and you're not the CEO. You are limited in the range of influence you can have on the culture. And my experience with this is good organizations who care about this stuff, the caring about it has to come from the top. And you have long, protracted discussions about what your values are. And and often there's alignment on that, right? So, everyone in our studio is like, we should hire qualified people and we shouldn't give, preference to people based on their, gender. And certainly the reality is games are creative, and having diverse voices on your teams is hugely important. So we should go out of our way, particularly to court that kind of diversity, whether that is just diversity of your thinking or diversity of your background or diversity in terms of gender, whatever it is, that's actually a value, right? So everyone in the leadership at our studio, I think, would agree with the statement that I just made. But you have long, protracted discussions about how that plays out and how to put it in practice. And that has to start at the top, right? Both the valuing it and figuring out the practices. Because if you are an entry-level employee at a studio with a toxic culture, you can't change that by yourself. You can't. And you can't, you're very limited in the range you can meaningfully impact that. I'm just being honest. Yeah. Which is why when folks are evaluating jobs, they should consider that, right? They absolutely should consider that. You should consider what the reputation of the company is. You should see what the internet says. You should try to network into people who have worked there and see what their perspective is on it. The other comment I want to make, and there's a real risk of this comment being misconstrued, so I want to go out of my way to clarify it. This is not a comment meant to excuse bad behavior, right? Bad behavior is bad behavior, and it's bad, right? Certain things happen that should not happen, right? If I go into the store, I'll use a non-ethical example. If I go into the store and I pay for something that's $1.73 with a $5 bill, I have the expectation that the person at the cash register should be able to make change for that in their head correctly. I would say that happens less often, right? That goes wrong more often than it goes right. You know what I mean? And in my experience in 2021. Does that mean I'm wrong to have the expectation? I don't think so. But does it mean that when I go into a store, I am prepared to deal with the eventuality that the person will make incorrect change or not know how to make change? Yes. Right. That's the spirit in which I'm offering this comment. So is bad behavior right? No, bad behavior is wrong. Bad behavior is bad, right? This is not to excuse bad behavior. What I will say, as someone who came to the games industry after working in other technology-oriented industries for the first several years of my career, the games industry, the kind of people who tend to work in the games industry are very passionate. They're very creative. They have strong opinions about stuff. And they are, to put it tactfully, generally speaking, not the most emotionally mature people in the world. Prior to working in the games industry, I did technology stuff in the insurance industry. By and large, folks there were more conventional, in their thinking. They were less creative. They were a little more inside whatever their intellectual box was. But on whole, they were more emotionally mature and conducted themselves with more professionalism. So that's my way of that. Now, I'm not saying go be an actuary, right? But I am saying if you are going to go into the games industry, you should be prepared to work with people who are not the most emotionally mature human beings on the planet. Right. That's not to denigrate any of my wonderful colleagues. There are many exceptions to that rule. And again, that's not to excuse objectively bad behavior, even if the root cause of that objectively bad behavior has something to do with someone's lack of emotional maturity. And to be further clear, there's a lot of stuff alleged in this lawsuit that unambiguously goes beyond the realm of this was an honest failing of somebody because they were emotionally immature, right? I'm not the majority of all the serious stuff in the lawsuit is way outside of that territory. But that is a reality I think folks have to be, prepared for. All industries have their quirks. Everybody's an individual and has their quirks and has things. But that is something. Sometimes you have to do something very different, and for me, Anthony, it was a period of adjustment because when I started working with people who came out of big studio mentalities, right, I was consistently blown away by their level of talent, their level of skill, their experience, and their creativity, and consistently shocked at how routinely they engaged in behavior that would have got them fired if they worked at an insurance company. And I'm not even talking about the stuff like you showed your genitals to someone.
That's well beyond.
I'm just talking about, which is obviously well beyond them and ought to get you fired anywhere. But again, I don't want to sidebar the discussion, but just in general, don't show your genitals to anyone who you aren't sure wants to see your genitals. That's general good. That's a little dad advice for you. But anyway, I'm just more talking, cultural behavior or how they related to people or things like that, stuff that would have gotten you fired. Mm-hmm. Like happened on a weekly basis. And the attitude was like, oh yeah, so-and-so did that. Oh, well. So that is depressing news. Yeah. That's the reality of that. I mean, I guess Mike, I'll throw it back to you, Anthony. You read news like that. You're obviously, as you said, it's inappropriate. You're upset by it. How does that affect your perception of a company as a gamer? How would it? I mean, does it influence? You're like, oh, I would not support a company that did this kind of stuff. I wouldn't buy their products, or because people are talking about, there have been people who've been talking about boycotts. There have been a number of media outlets or Twitch and YouTube personalities who are like, no, I'm not going to cover. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to cover Activision Blizzard stuff.
And I think that's fairly understandable, especially if you read that and you're disgusted about what you read. I understand that reaction, and I think it's honestly just unfortunate, and it's tough because especially when it's wound up in so much work that those employees put into something they love, something they're passionate about, games that people love, and to tie it in with that, that culture and learning about that, it's hard to hear. So I think it's it's like, it's one of those old sayings, like, you don't want to know how something gets made kind of thing. Which it shouldn't be that way. It's not like this is like this is a product. These are human beings we're talking about here. This is not just just a product or something that, so I think when it's tough because it's hard these days when we know so much and to look at many companies and not find something wrong, like especially with these large, gigantic corporations. It's just sad that we see so many institutional problems. So it's kind of one of those things where, like you said before, I agree with. It's not something that, unfortunately, it's not something you could just say, well, if every single person as an individual wanted to make that change, it is something that kind of, unfortunately, has to start from the top, because there is that power balance and there is that, community and culture that the company itself is building that can sometimes be hard to fight through if you feel like you're not, being heard or in that position to fight through, especially if you're on the lower end of, just being a worker and not to see, a higher end executive. So I guess in terms of, should people boycott? If that's your prerogative, I understand that.
I guess people have to make their own decisions about that. Mm-hmm. My question, what I was curious about was, as a consumer of video games, does news like this, like let's just say, for the sake of argument, 100% of these allegations were proven true, right? Would that in fact influence your purchasing behavior for Activision Blizzard games?
I think it would. I think it's one of those things where, and this may sound pessimistic or not a bad look at the world, but it's one of those things where it's like sometimes, almost people don't want to know, or because I feel like if you look into a lot of companies, sometimes you may find, maybe not this egregious, but I think sometimes you may find, like on these higher scales, like things, we people use iPhones every day, and those are made with very unethical practices. I'm not trying to throw in other negative topics, but I think there's a lot of times people are suffering, or there are very bad things happening for the sake of a commercial product, or for the sake of a business. So it's tough, where it's almost like, as an ethical moral standard, can you even comfortably live with all your daily electronics and food and everything you do without running into some sort of ethical dilemma?
And you said
much broader topic than that question. But.
Well, it is, and it's interesting, philosophical discussion. But you said something earlier that is maybe another perspective on what I was saying, which is you have to take things in the cultural or societal context in which they exist, right? To a degree, right? Because again, people. So when it comes to behavior in the games industry, right, there is conduct, like a lot of the stuff alleged in this lawsuit, that is just not okay. It's just not okay. It's not okay in any employment, situation ever. Period. Full stop. Right. And you shouldn't accept that.
And it's not just an
we shouldn't be.
Change,
I'm not advocating for
place.
It should never happen. I'm not advocating for tolerance of that. Then when I say you have to, working in the industry, you have to be prepared to work with some people who are emotionally immature and may behave inappropriately in emotionally immature ways. That's not to excuse the conduct. No. And when I say that, I'm not talking about the objectively over the line stuff, right? Because that should never happen, and nobody should. There's
a difference between differences of opinions versus inappropriate opinions versus just fully off, terrible actions.
I'll give you a concrete example of something I mean. If you go work in the insurance industry, you could go years in your career going to meetings where no one yells, no one calls you names. You may have disagreements, but it's all very polite and collegial. You could do that, right? If you are on a team in the game industry, one of your colleagues will likely do something that rubs you the wrong way, as sort of inappropriate, behavior. They yell at you. They do some light form of name calling. It feels like you're being bullied to some degree. Again, I'm not getting into the wildly inappropriate stuff. That I'm saying you should be prepared that will happen, right? And the trade-off there is you get to work, you get to make games, you get to work with incredibly creative people, you get to do really innovative stuff, you get to do all of the good things, but that is a thing you have to consider. And again, because I got to say it every single time I make that point, that is not excusing the objectively inappropriate stuff. Game companies should not pay women less than men. Game companies should not be denying women promotions because they might go off and have a baby. Right. You should not be crawling around the floor, in between your female colleagues' cubicles and touching them inappropriately. The managers should not be having romantic relationships with their subordinates and sharing photos of the subordinate with their male colleagues. These are none of that is okay, right? There is no universe in which any of that is okay. Should never happen. I'm not saying be accepting of that. So it's depressing. It's a little bit of this is a depressing episode, but I think it's a dose of reality. And I do think,
unfortunately,
all I can say is, as I said earlier, I think organizations that care about this stuff talk about it, debate it, figure out the best way to enact their vision. I like to think of myself as someone in a management position who does that. I will tell you straight up, I have not always lived up to the standards I would set for myself, right? There have been things that I have done or interactions that I've had with employees who later I found out that was that either I thought I was trying to do one thing and it came off a totally different way, or I was trying to do something and then I realized later that was a bad thing to have tried to do, and I had a moment of realization or growth. So again, I'm not saying it's not always easy, even when you have the best of intentions, and folks can mess up, and it's extraordinarily hard even when you're conscientious about trying to do it the right way. But I think in general, if more people cared about this stuff, if more people wanted to, in leadership positions, debated these values, debated how to enact them, had a dialogue with the folks who are most directly affected by the issues. And as you said earlier, Anthony, if even though there are real challenges to it, and the burden shouldn't be on the run-of-the-mill employees in a company, saying something is not okay, and not being part of it, is something that you can do. And in a lot of these contexts, silence gets interpreted as compliance or agreement. And that's and if there's one thing you can do in the run of the mill, it's, if you feel strongly about this stuff, don't allow your silence to be interpreted as agreement. Even if again, if you can't stop, if there's such a pervasive culture and it's bad and you can't completely stop the behavior, then just saying, I don't agree with that. I'm not, this is not appropriate and I'm not going to be a participant in it. That carries weight. That it can be difficult. It can have negative repercussions on you, as appears to have been, as is alleged in this suit, where it's like some people went to HR with stuff and HR laughed it off or had reprisals against them and denied people promotions. So it's not, again, none of this is easy for if you're the run-of-the-mill employee,
and especially if you're the victim of something like this, and not
forget about it.
Not to go off on the obvious actions that took place, but or even more inappropriate behavior, but not on the same level. I think it's one of those things where it's a worry of a lot of people. Am I going to be blacklisted from this industry if I say something? Am I going to be looked at differently, or is the culture going to continue and I'm going to be just pushed out? And there's that worry of some people being afraid to come forward about or an issue you have depending on what it is. And I think that, like you said before, it's up to I think it is a big responsibility of, in a leadership role, to set those morals and to set the set the standards of the way you're going to treat your employees and the way you're going to run as a company. And I think that reminding and having those morals be something interior inside the company is discussed and and tried to understood, and that people are trying to understand each other on a daily basis, rather than maybe just having those policies on an outside scale, but then, like this Activision Blizzard case, and then we had no idea on the inside. It looked very different from what, perceived. I'm sure their corporate values on a website page probably sounded a lot better than what was actually going on behind the scenes in that case. So I think it comes to accountability, of having that corporate culture, and that's on a larger scale than just the individual. But at the same time, you need to be, it helps to be an advocate for yourself, and it helps to be aware of these issues that you can, fight the injustice and things that, even smaller unacceptable things that may pop up in the workplace. So again, it's just it's hard to have like a definitive answer to end that discussion, because these are problems that are large, societal, cultural problems and cultural problems in the industry, and it's more, it's tough to, you need to have these conversations in order to build up a culture that changes those harmful norms, I guess.
So so I completely agree with that. So we're over our time a little bit, Anthony. I want to ask you one more question to close, and then maybe, let you have the last word on this before goodbye. So, and again, this is another one of those generational things for me. I'm curious how someone of your generation perceives that. You're I don't think I'm telling any tales out of school when I say you're in college, you're wrapping up, you're coming to the end of your college time. You're going to be looking for a job. You're going to be potentially looking for jobs in the game industry or other entertainment, industries. When you are considering where you want to look for jobs, or if you were considering employment offers, how important, and I would encourage you to, be 100% honest. How important is it to you to consider the culture, the reputation of places you might work? Is that an active phase for, of a job search for you?
That's a great question. Because I think for a lot of people, especially in the games industry, maybe like, well, what's my favorite game? I want to go work there. I want to make what I like. Maybe your focus is more topic based and where you want to work on. But for me, and maybe this is an individual perspective, maybe some people may not agree with me, but I almost worry more about, the culture and what I want to feel like I'm part of something that is part of a vision that I believe in. I don't want to feel like my vision or my corporate, our methodology or our ethics is just something that's just there, and I'm here to, just make money and make this game. Obviously, it's a job. You need to make a living. You want to make a product that you're proud of. But at the same time, you want to, I think, especially in from my perspective, I think in this day and age, you want to work for a company that, has values that you align with, and has a culture that you feel comfortable going to work every day, and maybe that's just a work ethic kind of thing. Because for me, I would like to feel like my work has a value, and I feel valued on that team, and I feel like I'm putting work in towards a vision that I believe in, not something that I'm just working just to get to the end of the day and go home. And a job is a job. I don't want to diminish that for other people, but I just think that I do think having a sense of purpose and having a sense of being comfortable and knowing that you can speak about things you want to speak about, and maybe I think that's really important to the day-to-day workplace, just the vibe and the ethics of the whole job.
I mean, I'm as an old guy who is a manager and hirer of people, I am relieved to hear you say that. And I, if the surveys and the data about your generation are accurate, I think that's a very common sentiment, right? I think that your generation, more so than say my generation or older generations, the data would suggest you folks of your generation think about this more, and the ethics and the culture and the reputation and does this company have a purpose, right? Do I agree with that? Does it align with my values? What is the cultural environment like? Where does this company stand on various issues? That factors more into hiring, decisions. And again, it's a factor. As you said, there's no getting around the fact that you have to eat, and and it's not like you can have any job in the world that you want. You have a finite range of options that are open to you at any point in time. But to me, I would rather work with people, and that's the thing. And that, maybe if I can end it on a positive note, the flip side of the games industry is full of, passionate people who are sometimes emotionally immature. The flip side of that is they're passionate people. You know, and there are people who I've had the pleasure of working with for years, who we've had significant disagreements over stuff. We continue to have disagreements over things on a weekly basis. And sometimes I think they're completely off, right? Like, it's not even like, oh, we have a different opinion. I'm like, you're just nuts. That's nuts. Right. Where that's my opinion of it. And honestly, I wouldn't trade the folks like that for anything. And I'll take a million people like that on a project team over people who don't genuinely care about what they're doing and don't have strong opinions. Because as long as you have a strong opinion and you have passion and you're willing to have a discussion and like you believe in things like logic and facts and have debates, we'll figure it out. You know what I mean? We'll figure it out. The diversity of perspectives is great. I'm easily wrong about stuff, you know, for every time I'm right about something, I'm wrong 2 times at least. So it's not like I have a monopoly on being right about stuff. You need the other perspectives. You need people to look at it from a different way, and what you end up with as a team is better. So that's the positive side of it. And if you can make that happen in a good cultural environment and not, of course, avoid the objectively horrible stuff, but even on the day-to-day basis and the more routine stuff, try to optimize that culture and get it better. That's the holy grail. That's what I think 100%. You got to go for.
And I to just sum that up, I just agree. Like, obviously, bad actions are bad actions. There's no getting around that. But at the same time, you do have to be, open to getting into disagreements. It's not going to be perfect sunshine every day. Everybody's going to love every idea you have, and everything will just be great and be all. There are going to be days where you're going to disagree with people, whether it's a game concept or a logical concept on something. That's, unfortunately, sometimes that's life, and you have to work through those disagreements. But obviously, with the obvious exception, again, saying that of actual disrespectful and egregious acts, you have to, I think there's an old quote of the only true wisdom is that you don't know some things. So so if you at least go in with an open mind and try to, be passionate, give your point of view, but also be open to others' point of view and try to work that out with each other and just be collaborative. That's probably the best piece of advice you could have.
We should organize, we should take a note on this, Anthony. We should organize a session that's all about these kind of early career, or a series of sessions about these early career, getting into the industry, how to deal with these kind of things, and again, get a diversity of perspectives, because I do think me as a hirer, and an old white dude has a certain perspective, and that there's a relevance. I don't mean to suggest there's relevancy to that, but someone who is 20 years younger than me and female and a person of color trying to break into the industry, someone who is a veteran of the AAA games, industry, getting a variety of perspectives on that into the discussion, would be useful, and I think folks would find it valuable. So that's potentially another series of these we could do besides news updates. So again, we're over our time. This was some depressing topics today, but I think important ones to be talked about, and hopefully can give folks a more informed sense of what goes on in the industry and how to think about stuff. So we've got some other streams coming up this week, I think, back to project streams. Anthony, do you want to just go over what we know about the schedule there so far real quick?
So we're going to be back tomorrow. I know Corey has a stream planned for Dawn City Heist, and he's probably going to be looking at some gray boxing topics. He may be playing gray boxing, he may be testing some gray box levels. So look out for that tomorrow.
Yes, I have seen some. I made a gray box level on his
game,
but I've seen some other ones out there as well. So I'm excited to see the play tests.
Yeah, so we're looking. Corey, obviously, we said on last stream, was out sick last week, so he's going to be back this week. He's probably going to play Brian's level, as well as go over maybe some gray boxing instructional tests and stuff like that. And he may be back on Thursday as well. We'll see. But then Friday morning, Kayla will be up with a Feisty Ferret stream, and we'll be looking at some development concepts and also maybe some concept levels there. We'll see.
Cool. Sounds great. All right. Well, thanks for watching, everybody. And please check out the streams later in the week. And I guess we'll be back probably next week, Anthony, with more news.
Yep. We will. Thank you for having me, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for watching. Take care.
Take it easy.